Hello, and welcome back to Velvet Haunt. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love reading every single one. If you enjoy chilling tales that linger in the velvet dark, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you dare. Relax your mind. Let the outside world fade away. And let's begin. Story 1. Every night, I have the same dreams. Whenever I close my eyes, I am forced to live through the same memories again. More than 40 years have passed, but some part of my mind is still trapped in those dark nights from my childhood. Life continued, of course, and in some way, so did I. But I am not sure that what I did can truly be called moving on. My entire life became focused on one purpose. I wanted to find and destroy the creature responsible for everything that had happened to me. I wanted to kill the man-made from mist. At least, that was what I believed I wanted. For years, I begged fate to give me the chance to take revenge. I made choices that would have broken most people. I crossed moral and legal lines. I destroyed friendships, abandoned relationships, and gave up any possibility of a normal life. I knew what I was becoming, but I kept going because revenge was the only thing that gave my life direction. Then, when the chance finally came, I could not do it. I stood over him with a gun in my hand, but 3 other monsters entered my mind. Remorse, guilt, regret. I tried to fight those feelings. I tried to remind myself of everything he had taken from me. But in the end, I was too weak to complete the one task I had devoted my whole life to. I let him live. At that moment, it felt like the right choice. When I walked away, I felt as though a heavy stone had been lifted from my chest. For the first time in years, I believed I had chosen mercy instead of hatred. Now, looking back with clearer eyes, I am no longer certain. I am getting ahead of myself, though. To explain what happened, I must begin with my childhood. My name is Yaroslav Teuter. I was born in a small village in Siberia, far from any large town or modern settlement. The name of the village does not matter. Knowing what I know now, perhaps my relatives were right when they said outsiders had no place there. My village seemed frozen in another century. When I was growing up, we had no electricity, no telephones, and none of the comforts that people in the cities considered normal. We lived off the land. We grew our own food, raised animals, cut wood, and depended on one another to survive the long winters. The people of my village followed very old beliefs. They were sometimes called Old Believers, although that name was not completely accurate. My people had never accepted Christianity. They still worshiped the ancient gods and spirits of the land. They prayed to Perun, Veles, Svarog, Dazbog, Mokosh, and many smaller spirits, whose names were rarely spoken outside our community. They believed forests, rivers, storms, animals, and even stones could carry a spirit within them. What people in the outside world called myths or children's stories, my people accepted as truth. There were no doctors in our village. The elders also claimed that there were no diseases. They said no one had ever died from illness before Soviet officials began entering our region. Whenever an elderly person died, the villagers said the horned shepherd had taken them to his distant grazing fields. That was what they said when my grandfather died. He had appeared strong only days earlier, but then he became tired, stopped eating, and passed away in his sleep. Less than a year later, my grandmother died too. Everyone said grief had carried her away because she could not bear to live without the man she had loved. Whenever someone young died, or when a person was killed in an accident, the villagers blamed spirits, curses, or angry gods. Disease did not exist in their minds. At least, it did not exist until Boris Bogdanov became sick. Everyone called him Boris Beard because of the thick gray beard that covered most of his face. He had always been one of the strongest men in the village. He could carry heavy sacks of grain over each shoulder and walk through deep snow without slowing down. Then, one spring, he developed a fever. At first, no one was worried. People said he had angered a spirit near the river or eaten food that had been touched by something unclean. They burned herbs inside his home, whispered prayers over him, and placed carved symbols near his bed. Nothing helped. The fever stayed. Boris began losing weight. His wide shoulders became narrow, his arms became thin, and his cheeks sank inward. In only a few weeks, the powerful man we had known became a weak figure who could barely sit up. He looked smaller than my grandfather had during his final days. The villagers claimed evil spirits were eating his body from the inside. Then Boris's wife became ill. After that, his children developed fevers, too. Before long, sickness moved from house to house. Half the village was soon coughing, sweating, and growing thinner. Some people became confused and violent. Others fell into deep sleep and never woke again. Then, my father became sick. I remember the night death first entered our home. It was early spring, and the air outside was still painfully cold. I woke in the middle of the night because a freezing wind had entered the room. Our house was small, and my parents slept only a short distance from my bed. The darkness that night seemed different. It was deeper than ordinary darkness, almost like a solid substance pressing against my face. I lifted my hand in front of my eyes, but I could not see my fingers. A cold feeling moved down my back. For the first time in years, I was afraid of the dark. I was 11 years old. I believed I was becoming a man. Yet I lay frozen beneath my blankets, nearly wetting myself like a small child. The darkness felt alive. It seemed to stare at me from every corner of the room. For several moments, I could not move. Then, I heard a sound. It was quiet and wet, like an animal drinking from a bowl. I turned toward my parents' bed. The moment I saw what was there, whatever remained of my childhood disappeared. My body reacted before my mind understood. I slipped from the bed and dropped to my knees. My mouth opened, but no scream came out. I could only breathe in short, painful gasps while tears filled my eyes. Every frightening story the elders had told us suddenly returned to me. Every warning about creatures that entered homes at night. Every tale I had stopped believing. All of it was true. Something was crouched over my father. At first, it looked like a human shape made from thin mist. It was almost invisible. Yet somehow I could see it more clearly than anything else in the room. Its body carried a weak, unnatural glow, as if the darkness itself wanted me to notice it. Its face was pressed against my father's neck. Its teeth were buried in him. The creature was feeding. I must have made some small sound because it stopped drinking and slowly turned toward me. It rose from the bed. The thing became taller as it straightened. Its body was narrow and twisted. Its arms were unnaturally long, and its fingers nearly touched the floor. It looked like a poor imitation of a human being, stretched into the shape of a snake. Mist moved around its body, hiding most of its features. I could see only enough to understand how terrible it was. Its eyes glowed dark red, its lips pulled back into a wide smile. Behind those gray lips were sharp teeth stained with fresh blood. A long tongue rested between its jaws. The image burned itself into my mind and never left. The creature lifted one hand. Each finger was thin and ended in a curved claw. It placed one finger against its lips. It wanted me to remain silent. I could not fight it. I could not call for help. I could not even turn away. Tears rolled down my face as I nodded. The creature's smile widened. Then it lowered itself and crawled into the darkness. Its long limbs moved across the floor without making a sound. Within seconds, it disappeared into the night. After it was gone, I remained on my knees. My entire body hurt from fear. It took every bit of strength I had to stand and return to my bed. I pulled the blanket over myself, but I did not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blood around its mouth. I saw its teeth in my father's neck. I saw those red eyes watching me. The next morning, my father was sick. His skin was hot, and sweat covered his face. He said his body ached, and he could barely stand. I knew what had caused it. I also knew I could never tell anyone. In my village, a boy old enough to work on the family farm was treated like a man. A man was expected to protect his family. If I told the villagers that I had watched a creature attack my father without doing anything, they might decide I had helped it. They might say I had brought the evil into our home. They might even decide that I was the creature. So I remained silent. Shame began eating me from the inside. Every day I watched my father grow weaker. Every night, the man made from mist returned. I would wake and find it crouched over him, feeding from his neck. Sometimes it looked directly at me while it drank. It wanted me awake. It wanted me to see what it was doing. I told myself that the next night would be different. I promised myself I would grab a knife. I promised I would shout. I promised I would attack it, even if it killed me. But each time it appeared, I fell to my knees again. I could do nothing except stare, night after night. The creature fed on my father's fading life and took a little more of my sanity with it. Within 2 months, my father was dead. When we buried him, I felt something close to relief. I hated myself for feeling that way, but I hoped the creature had taken what it wanted. I believed it might finally leave our family alone. I was wrong. The world is cruel. A starving predator does not show mercy to its prey. As long as the man made from mist remained hungry, it would keep taking from me. One summer night, I woke because the room had become cold, far too cold for that time of year. Fear immediately filled my mind. I turned quickly toward my mother's bed. She was sleeping alone. I saw no mist, no red eyes, and no shape bending over her. Still, I could not relax. I stayed awake until morning. In truth, I have never slept properly since that night. When the sun rose, my mother was burning with fever. I knew he had returned. I believed the creature would come again to feed on her, so I forced myself to remain awake each night. I sat near her bed holding a knife, gathering every small piece of courage I had. The man made from mist never returned. Instead, he left me to watch my mother die. Her condition became worse much faster than my father's had. The fever stole the color from her face. Within days, she could no longer stand. Soon, she lost the ability to speak clearly. Then, she began losing her mind. She barked and coughed like a sick animal. She scratched at the air and pulled at her own blankets. Whenever I brought her water, she turned away in terror. If I came too close, she tried to bite me. I kept telling myself that she was still my mother. I kept speaking to her even when she could no longer understand me. For almost a week, she remained violent and confused. Then, her body suddenly became still. She fell into a deep sleep. For 3 days, she did not wake. On the third day, she stopped breathing. What remained in the bed was not the mother I remembered. It was a pale, thin shell with sharp bones showing beneath the skin. While something unnatural destroyed my family, the rest of the village was collapsing too. By the time my mother died, more than half the villagers were dead. Houses stood empty. Animals wandered without owners. Smoke no longer rose from many chimneys. Then the Soviets came. They entered wearing strange protective suits that covered their bodies and faces. To us, they looked like visitors from another world. They searched every house and took away any healthy children they could find. I was one of them. I fought them with everything I had. I kicked, screamed, and tried to run back toward my home. Several grown men had to hold me down before they could place me inside a vehicle. At the time, I believed they were dragging me away from my family and my people. Only later did I understand that they were taking me away from hell. The authorities sent me to an orphanage in the city. The outside world changed everything I knew. There were electric lights, running water, doctors, schools, machines, and streets filled with more people than I had ever imagined. For years, I struggled to fit in. Eventually, I learned how to dress, speak, and behave like the city people. I learned to hide my old beliefs and keep my memories to myself. The doctors called what had happened to me trauma. They tried to help, but they could not repair what had been broken. The wounds were too deep, and some of them were not only inside my mind. I adapted to my new life, but I never forgot my purpose. I wanted revenge. As I grew older, I began searching for the illness that had destroyed my village. I overheard officials speaking about an ancient strain of Siberian anthrax that had somehow returned and killed half the population. They claimed the marks on people's necks were infected wounds. I knew they were lying, or at least mistaken. The man made from mist had been real. I had watched him feed. Still, the Soviets were correct about one thing. What had destroyed my village was a disease. It simply was not anthrax. It was something far worse. The infection turned human beings into creatures that survived by drinking blood. They existed somewhere between life and death. Their bodies still moved and thought, but many of the ordinary processes of life had changed or stopped completely. There appeared to be only one reliable treatment: the complete destruction of the brain. I reached that conclusion after many years of research, much of it done through illegal methods. The first important idea came to me after another nightmare about my mother. In the dream, she rose from her bed and fell onto all fours. Foam covered her mouth. She coughed and barked at the same time. Her body moved in an unnatural way as she crawled across the floor. She reached my bed, dug her nails into the blankets, and pulled herself upward. Then she screamed into my face. The sound was part human cry and part animal cough. Her eyes were wide with madness. She lunged forward, trying to bite anything she could reach. I hid beneath my blankets, but she tore at them until she found my arm. Her teeth closed around my flesh. The pain woke me. I sat upright, covered in cold sweat and struggling to breathe. That was when the idea came to me. At the time, I was studying medicine with a focus on viruses. My mother's behavior reminded me of rabies. I began to wonder whether the man made from mist carried a condition that behaved like an extreme and unusual form of rabies. The pattern appeared simple. 9 out of 10 infected people died during the first stage. Their bodies wasted away beneath fever, confusion, and violent changes to the nervous system. The remaining person fell into a coma so deep that they appeared dead. Later, they woke changed. The survivors could no longer be considered fully alive in the normal sense. Their bodies had become adapted to feeding on blood and small amounts of living flesh. I do not say this to make the condition sound supernatural. Much of what happened was biologically possible, although extremely unusual in a human being. The infection changed the victim into something like a human-shaped leech. These creatures were stronger than normal people, difficult to kill, and able to survive terrible injuries. However, they were not perfect predators. In the modern world, they were badly suited to living among their prey. Their need for blood was obvious. What was less obvious was that their appearance often looked similar to severe tuberculosis. They became pale, thin, weak-looking, and constantly ill. That was how I eventually found subjects for my research. I began searching records for prisoners who appeared to have advanced tuberculosis, but had somehow committed extremely violent crimes, including murder and cannibalism. Through contacts I made with local authorities, I obtained the body of one death row prisoner. The man had been executed, and everyone believed he was dead. When I first saw him, I almost stopped breathing. His body strongly resembled the creature from my childhood. His limbs were long. His skin was nearly white. His frame was thin and unnatural. His face was different, but the resemblance to the man made from mist was impossible to ignore. As I prepared for the examination, I noticed a small movement in one of his muscles. I told myself it was only my imagination. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was turning my back on the body while reaching for an instrument. The dead man rose before I could react. His long, cold arms wrapped around my neck from behind. The strength in his thin body was unbelievable. No human being with such a weak appearance should have been able to hold me so tightly. He began cutting off the blood supply to my brain. Luckily, our positions were awkward, and he could not apply the hold correctly. Otherwise, I would have died or awakened as something like him. I reached blindly across the table, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. Then I heard his voice beside my ear. It was dry and rough. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am starving." The apology shocked me more than the attack. The thing trying to kill me was still human enough to feel regret. Fear had always been my greatest enemy. In that moment, it became useful. Adrenaline filled my body and helped me fight through the weakness. My fingers closed around a scalpel. I drove it into the side of his head. His arms immediately loosened. He fell behind me with a heavy crash, striking the table and knocking instruments onto the floor. As blood returned to my brain, I became dizzy. My heart raced and terrible thoughts filled my mind. Fear became anger. Anger became rage. I turned and began kicking the body. I kicked him again and again. I did not stop after he stopped moving. I did not stop when his face broke. Blood, teeth, and pieces of hair spread across the floor. I continued until I could no longer recognize him as human. Then the rage left me. I collapsed beside the corpse, shaking. I knew he was dead this time. His skull was broken, and the brain had been destroyed. A thinking creature could not survive without its brain. Still, I remained terrified. I was not only shaken by the attack, I was afraid of what I had done. That moment became another memory that returned in my dreams. Night after night, I watched myself destroy the man's face. Each dream became worse than the last. I told myself it had been self-defense. My mind understood. My heart did not. In my nightmares, I was always the monster. I regret admitting that he was only the first of his kind I killed. Compared to the others, his death may have been mercifully quick. Afterward, I performed the examination I had originally planned. The results explained why his execution had failed. His heart was black, small, and almost useless. It had become a dried, damaged muscle. A bullet to the chest would not reliably kill one of these creatures because the heart was no longer necessary in the same way it was for a normal human. His lungs contained thick scar tissue that appeared capable of repairing itself. His digestive system had also changed. It was designed to hold and process large amounts of liquid very quickly. Some circulation remained because the creature's muscles still needed energy. However, blood flow did not seem to depend mainly on the heart. Movement of the muscles and pressure inside the body appeared to push fluids through the system. This helped explain the pale skin. The lack of proper nutrition explained the thin frame. Unfortunately, the examination did not give me all the answers I wanted. However, I discovered something inside his mouth. The creature produced draculin, an anticoagulant normally found in vampire bats. It prevented blood from clotting while the creature fed. I hated the word, but the truth was clear. These unfortunate people were vampires. Perhaps some of the old stories had always been true. That did not matter to me then. I needed to learn more. For years, I searched using methods that were dangerous, illegal, and often unsuccessful. My only comfort was the belief that these creatures were solitary. They rarely lived together, and probably could not warn others about me. Around the beginning of the new millennium, luck finally found me. Not long before the Armin Meiwes case became widely known, I found something on an internet message board. A man had posted an advertisement asking for a willing blood donor. He offered money, but this was not a normal medical request. He wanted to drink the donor's blood. If possible, he wanted to drink it directly from the person's body. He sounded exactly like the kind of individual I had been searching for. I contacted him and volunteered. I had no intention of allowing him to bite me, so I obtained several bags of stored blood. Because of my work, this was not difficult. 1 week later, we arranged to meet at his house. I carried a pistol because I did not know whether he would become violent. To my surprise, he was polite. For a person who drank human blood and sometimes ate flesh, he behaved like an ordinary and even thoughtful man. The only strange part of our meeting was his insistence that the lights remain low. At first, he was suspicious when I offered stored blood in exchange for information. Once he tasted it, he became more cooperative. As we spoke, I realized how similar we were. He told me that very little interested him anymore. He could not form strong emotional bonds. He rarely felt joy, love, sadness, or excitement. The only powerful feeling left to him came when he fed. I understood him more than I wanted to admit. By then, I also felt little beyond disappointment, anger, and constant fear. I had destroyed every friendship and relationship in my life because of my obsession with revenge. I had given up love, family, comfort, and peace for a mission I did not even know I could complete. The man confirmed many of my beliefs. The infected preferred to live alone. They stayed away from other intelligent life unless they needed to feed. Because blood and flesh provided such limited nutrition, they often entered a state similar to hibernation. They could remain asleep for years. They strongly disliked bright light and usually moved or hunted at night. Most importantly, he told me that the infected rarely traveled far from the place where they had first changed. If they could find enough prey nearby, they remained in the same area. If food became scarce, they migrated like any other animal. This information told me that the man made from mist might still be near my village. As we continued talking, I noticed sorrow in the man's red eyes. He looked deeply tired. I asked whether he was happy with the life he had. He said no. I wished he had asked me the same question. I wanted to tell someone how miserable I had become. He never asked, but I believe he understood. Perhaps he saw his own emptiness reflected in me. In a rare moment of sympathy, I offered to kill him. He smiled. He admitted that he had tried to end his life many times, but nothing had worked. He said he was not depressed. He was simply tired of endless boredom. At the time, I did not understand the difference. I explained that the secret to killing his kind was destroying the brain. He joked that he did not own a firearm. I pulled out my pistol and aimed at his head. "You will not need one," I said. He laughed. While he was still laughing, I pulled the trigger. The sound stopped. His body fell. The room became completely silent. This time, he was truly dead. Even though he had accepted his death, the memory still entered my dreams. That nightmare was not as frightening as the others. It was sadder. He had lost every reason to live. He existed only to feed, sleep, and feed again. The more I studied the infected, the more I understood that they were still people. They had not chosen what happened to them. Nature had reduced them to animals ruled by hunger, while leaving enough intelligence inside them to understand what they had lost. They were victims of a terrible curse. In another way, so was I. My obsession continued growing until I could no longer ignore it. I had to end the nightmare that had consumed my life. Using what I had learned, I returned to Siberia. Several weeks later, I reached the area near my birthplace. I arrived at night because darkness was the best time to find him. Even seeing the village from a distance was painful. With every step, another buried memory rose inside me. I remembered my father's fever. I remembered my mother biting at the air. I remembered empty houses and men in protective suits. Behind every memory stood the same shape, tall, pale, and surrounded by mist. Only the red eyes were clear. Only the blood on the smile had color. Fear and anger moved through me together. Some part of my body seemed to know where to look. I felt as though the creature and I had been tied together since the first night he saw me. A red thread of fate connected us across the years. I could almost smell the iron scent of blood leading me forward. I carried a pistol and planned to burn his body afterward. I imagined reducing him to ash and scattering the remains into a river. The hardest part was knowing I could not safely enter the village or speak to any surviving relatives. I had lived in the outside world for decades. I might have carried diseases that the isolated people had never encountered. One careless visit could have killed them. If that happened, I would be no better than the creature I had come to destroy. The knowledge that I could not reunite with anyone from my childhood caused a pain I cannot properly describe. That pain disappeared when I found him. He was resting in a small den near the cemetery. It almost seemed like a childish joke, an undead creature sleeping beside graves. He lay completely still. Without the darkness, fear, and mist surrounding him, he looked different from my memories. He was not as tall as I remembered. In fact, he was not much larger than I had been when I first saw him. The realization made me dizzy. He did not appear to be an adult. Perhaps he had been a child or a young teenager when the infection changed him. My memories had transformed him into a towering demon because I had seen him through the eyes of a terrified 11-year-old. Now he looked small. He looked weak. He looked almost harmless. For a moment, I became a frightened child again, standing before a monster that might have existed more in my imagination than in reality. I raised my pistol and aimed at his head. The roles had reversed. He was sleeping and helpless. I had all the power. In that moment, I became the man made from mist. I stood over a defenseless creature, ready to take its life while it could do nothing to stop me. My finger rested on the trigger. I could not pull it. I thought of my father. I thought of my mother. I thought of every year I had spent suffering because of him. Still, I could not shoot. Killing him would not bring my family back. It would not repair my mind. It would not return the humanity I had sacrificed during my search. It would not stop the nightmares or remove the fear. Nothing could heal those wounds. I would carry them for as long as I remained human. As much as I hated to admit it, I pitied him. He was only another victim. So I lowered the gun. At the time, I believed mercy had saved me from becoming a monster. Now I know that letting him live was a mistake. I did not leave without doing anything. I cut a small piece of flesh from his calf. He did not move when my knife passed through his pale skin. The flesh separated as easily as soft butter. Part of me wanted a small victory over him. It was a foolish and animal-like act of dominance against the creature whose shadow had controlled my entire life. But there was another reason. I had learned that people like him could no longer feel powerful emotions. I believed that if my guilt, fear, and regret ever became unbearable, the infection might offer a permanent escape. I took the flesh with me and stored it in my refrigerator. For a while, I tried to continue living. Eventually, my mind began to collapse. The three demons followed me everywhere. Remorse, guilt, regret. My desire to remain alive became weaker each day. I could have used my pistol, but I did not. Instead, I ate the piece of flesh I had taken from the man made from mist. I expected the infection to kill me. My body was already exhausted by stress, poor sleep, and years of obsession. I believed my immune system would fail during the first stage. I believed I would suffer for a few days and then die. There are very few permanent solutions in this world. There are even fewer quick solutions that end the way we expect. I did not die, not completely. Instead, the man made from mist was born again inside me. At first, the change felt wonderful. My senses became sharper. I could hear sounds from far away. I could see clearly in darkness. Every smell seemed powerful and new. The world felt exciting again. For a short time, I believed I had escaped my pain. But anything becomes ordinary when it never stops. The sharpness became normal. The excitement faded. Colors slowly disappeared from the world until everything seemed gray and empty. Even my memories lost their power. The nightmares still came, but they no longer frightened me. They were only moving pictures drifting through my mind. I could watch my father die without sadness. I could watch my mother crawl toward me without fear. I could watch myself kill the prisoner and feel nothing. Life is not better now. I do not suffer as I once did, but I also do not truly feel. The only time emotion returns is when I feed. When my teeth enter the neck of a drunk stranger, the world becomes alive for a few seconds. Blood brings warmth, color, pleasure, and meaning. Then it ends. Most of my existence is made of gray days and darker nights, interrupted only by a brief line of red. It is not enough. Somewhere along the way, I lost my pistol. Without it, I do not have an easy way to escape this endless tunnel of mist. Perhaps that is fitting. I once believed the greatest horror was pain. Then I believed it was fear. Later, I believed it was guilt. I was wrong each time. Sometimes I wish my nightmares could hurt me again. I wish I could wake sweating and terrified. I wish the memory of my parents could make me cry. At least pain would prove that something human still lived inside me. What is the purpose of remembering every mistake if the memories carry no weight? What is the purpose of tragedy if it cannot bring sorrow? What is the purpose of reliving blood-covered nightmares when they cannot cause fear, pain, love, or regret? There is no purpose. Everything I once wanted seems close enough to touch, yet whenever I reach for it, it moves away like smoke. Now, after endless boredom has consumed everything inside me, I finally understand what true horror is. The man made from mist was never only the creature that entered my childhood home. It was not the infected prisoner. It was not the lonely man who begged me to kill him. It is not even me. The man made from mist is the shape of pure horror itself. It is the emptiness that remains after every feeling has been taken away. It is the desire to feel something while knowing that nothing can reach you. It is a fear so strange and poisonous that it exists only to torment creatures intelligent enough to understand their own emptiness. And now, after spending my life running from him, hunting him, and finally becoming him, I know the truth. The man made from mist was never following me. He was waiting for me. Story 2. Most people believe social work is a calling. They imagine that everyone who enters this field was born with a pure heart and a deep desire to save the world. They picture kind, patient people who live only to help the weak, protect the innocent, and comfort anyone who has fallen through the cracks of society. Maybe that is true for some social workers. Maybe some of my coworkers really are saints waiting for their wings. Maybe they wake up every morning feeling blessed because they have another chance to serve humanity. That was never true for me. Social work is not holy work. There is nothing clean, gentle, or heavenly about it. Most of the time, it feels like fighting a war in a place where nobody wins. You deal with abuse, addiction, poverty, violence, loneliness, neglect, illness, and every other kind of suffering people can create for themselves and others. A person once described social work as riding a bicycle. While the bicycle is on fire, the road is on fire, and everything around you is burning because you are already in hell. That description has always felt accurate to me. Still, people sometimes ask why I have stayed in the profession for so long. They assume I must care deeply about helping mankind. I do care, at least sometimes, but that is not the real reason. The first reason is simple. I have been doing this job since the early 1990s. I started before most people had internet access in their homes, before smartphones, social media, and all the other things people now believe they cannot live without. I have done this work for so long that I am not sure I know how to do anything else. The second reason is more personal. The work distracts me. When you spend your days dealing with emergencies, broken families, dangerous clients, and people standing at the edge of disaster, you do not have much time to think about yourself. It is difficult to worry about your own memories while someone else is threatening to your own memories, while someone else is burned down his apartment because his girlfriend left him. I do not like thinking about my past. There are things buried inside my mind that I have never wanted to examine. Painful things, frightening things, memories that feel incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle hidden behind a locked door. Work keeps that door closed. Once I begin working on a case, I can forget to eat. I can work through the night without noticing how tired I am. My entire mind becomes focused on the person in front of me and the problem I am trying to solve. For many years, I believed that was all there was to it. Then, Charlie walked into my office. I was sitting at my desk between appointments when I noticed him entering through the front doors. The office was large, and he was at least 100 yards away, but something about him immediately caught my attention. He was young, tall, and good-looking in a way that seemed almost unnatural for the place. Most of the people who came through our doors looked exhausted, sick, frightened, angry, or lost. This man looked as though he had stepped out of a fashion advertisement. He was around 6'2", with medium-length curly brown hair. His hair was messy, but it seemed carefully messy, as though he had spent time making it look that way. He wore a black blazer over a black turtleneck and brown trousers. He did not look like someone who needed emergency housing, food assistance, addiction treatment, or protection from an abusive partner. At first, he stood near the entrance and slowly looked around the room. It was obvious he was searching for someone. I assumed it was not me. I had never seen him before. Then, our eyes met. The moment he saw me, he stopped looking around. He began walking directly toward my desk. There was no hesitation in his steps. He moved in a straight line, almost like a machine that had finally located its target. Working in social services teaches you to be careful. It is not unusual for strangers to blame you for what has happened to them. An abusive husband may become angry because you helped his wife escape. A father may threaten you because you reported him to child protection. Someone who has lost custody of a child may decide that you are responsible for destroying the family. There are countless reasons why a person might enter a social work office and attack someone. As the stranger approached, I quietly placed my right hand over a screwdriver on my desk. It was not the best weapon in the world, but it was better than nothing. He reached my desk and stopped a few feet away. I waited for him to shout, punch me, pull a knife, or make some kind of threat. Instead, he slammed an old newspaper onto my desk. Then he crossed his arms and stared at me as though I were wasting his time. The newspaper looked ancient. Its yellow pages were dry and weak, and the edges had begun to fall apart. I looked at the stranger. He looked at the newspaper. Then he looked back at me. He tapped one foot impatiently. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I put on my reading glasses and carefully examined the paper. It was a copy of the New York Times from the winter of 1993. I looked back at the stranger. He continued staring at me. I tried to speak in the calm, polite voice I usually used with difficult clients. Could you please explain what I am supposed to be looking at? The young man grabbed the paper from my hands. He began turning the pages quickly, clearly frustrated that I did not understand. At last, he found what he wanted. He pushed the newspaper back toward me and pointed at an article that had been circled in blue ink. The article appeared in an old reader-submitted dating advice section. Younger people may find that strange, but before the internet became part of everyday life, people sometimes sent relationship advice to major newspapers. Other people actually read it and took it seriously. I almost refused to read the article. In my career, I had met many people experiencing severe mental health crises. I had no desire to become a character in another stranger's private world of delusions. Still, curiosity won. I looked at the title. The moment I read it, I recognized it. The article had become famous in New York during the early years of my career. It was not famous because it offered useful advice about romance. It was connected to one of Brooklyn's strangest unsolved murder cases. The title was An Occultist's Guide to Love and Loss in the 20th Century. More than 30 years ago, 6 bodies were discovered across Brooklyn during a period of a little over 3 months. All 6 victims had been killed in the same impossible way. Something narrow and sharp had entered through the back of the neck and passed out through the front. The wounds were so clean that police were unsure what type of weapon could have made them. The victims had almost nothing in common. 2 were middle-aged men. 2 were an elderly married couple. 1 was a wealthy widow who owned a small business. The last was a talented high school football player with a promising future. The death of the teenager caused public fear to become panic. Until that point, some residents had convinced themselves that the killer was targeting older people or adults with certain habits. The boy's murder destroyed those theories. Anyone could be chosen. The bodies appeared at regular times. Roughly every 2 weeks, another victim was found. Police searched for connections between them, but there were none. They did not work in the same places. They did not visit the same businesses. They did not belong to the same clubs or churches. Some lived far away from the others. The only clear connection was the wound through the neck. Then the medical examiners discovered something much worse. A strange shape had been carved into the inside of each victim's skull, directly behind the forehead. Nobody understood how that was possible. The skulls had not been opened. There were no signs of surgery, yet the markings were there, cut into the bone between the eyes. Even more disturbing, evidence suggested that the shapes had been carved while the victims were still alive. Experts who studied occult symbols examined the markings, but they could not agree about where the designs came from. Some thought they resembled Northern European runes. Others believed they were connected to older religious symbols. A few said the shapes did not belong to any known culture. This was the early 1990s, during a period when many Americans were terrified of secret satanic groups. People saw devil worship in music, films, games, schools, and almost everything else. When the police commissioner mentioned strange rune-like symbols during a press conference, the entire city seemed ready to begin a witch hunt. The public demanded answers. The police had very few. Then an officer noticed a pattern in the New York Times. About 1 week before each victim was discovered, a short article appeared in the newspaper's dating advice section. Every article was written by someone using the name Lady Hemlock. The advice was usually confusing, but not openly violent. It discussed love, loss, destiny, bloodlines, spiritual energy, and the importance of finding a perfect partner. Each article also included a small printed symbol. 1 week later, that same symbol would be found carved inside someone's skull. The police immediately began searching for Lady Hemlock. They first believed the killer might work for the newspaper. It seemed suspicious that the articles were always published at exactly the right time. Lady Hemlock apparently knew when each article would appear and planned the murders around the publication schedule. The police questioned employees and searched internal records, but they never found a suspect. After the connection became public, one final victim appeared. That murder was different from the others. A trash can near a local park was found filled with human organs. The lungs, liver, intestines, kidneys, spleen, and other organs were all there. The only organ missing was the brain. Police searched for the body but never found it. The organs did not belong to any of the earlier victims. They also did not match any unidentified body discovered during the years that followed. The death was connected to Lady Hemlock because a symbol had been carved into the outside of the heart. After that, the murders stopped. Lady Hemlock was never identified. All of that history was interesting, but it did not explain why this silent young man was standing in front of my desk with the old article. I looked up at him. "What are you trying to tell me?" He immediately began making wild movements with his hands. He pointed at the article, then at himself, then at me. After that, he pointed at the newspaper again, then at his own chest, and finally back at me. He repeated the movements several times, becoming more frustrated with each attempt. That was how he later received the name Charlie. He never spoke, and he communicated through dramatic hand movements like an actor from an old silent film. Someone in the office compared him to Charlie Chaplin, and the name stayed with him. During that first meeting, however, I did not know what to call him. I only knew that he was making me uncomfortable. Suddenly, his expression changed. He looked excited, almost relieved, as though he had finally discovered the perfect way to explain himself. He began removing his blazer. Then he started pulling off his turtleneck. That was enough for me. "Marco," I called. "Please get this man out of here." Marco was our security guard. He was good at his job, although most of us liked him because he spent half his shifts quietly beatboxing near the entrance. Marco hurried over and grabbed the stranger. The young man began kicking and struggling as Marco dragged him toward the front doors. He did not try to attack anyone, but he seemed desperate to return to my desk. Marco threw the old newspaper outside after him. As the paper passed through the doorway, a small sticky note fell from between its pages and landed on the entrance mat. Marco picked it up. He read it, frowned, and then brought it to me. "Why are you giving that to me?" I asked. "I think it's meant for you," he said. The note contained one short message. "Thanks, Corvus. I appreciate the help. My name is Corvus." It is an unusual name, and very few strangers know it. I looked toward the entrance, but the young man was already gone. Over the next month, Charlie became a regular visitor. At first, the situation was almost funny. He would arrive with the same old article and try to place it in front of me. Security learned to recognize him, so he began finding new ways to reach me. One morning, he arrived before the office opened and waited outside. Another time, he mailed a copy of the article to me. On one evening, he followed me into the parking lot and tried to hand it to me beside my car. Every time, it was the same article. Every time, he pointed at it, at himself and at me. I offered to help him if he would give me useful information. I asked him to write his name, address, age, or place of birth. I asked if he needed shelter, medical care, food, or protection. He ignored every question. He only wanted me to read the article. I never called the police. Some people may consider that foolish, but Charlie never acted violently. He frightened people, and he refused to respect normal boundaries, but he never tried to hurt anyone. I believed he would eventually become bored and leave me alone. Instead, his condition became worse. He always wore the same black blazer, black turtleneck, and brown trousers. After several visits, I noticed that his beard was growing. His hair had become dirty. His clothes smelled. It was clear that he was living on the streets. That changed the way I saw him. He was no longer just an annoying stranger with an obsession. He was a young man who was lost, frightened, and possibly very ill. I wanted to help, but he refused every form of help I understood how to give. That reminded me of my own past. Before I became a social worker, I was homeless and destroying myself with alcohol. At least, that is what I had always believed. I spent my days drinking and my nights sleeping wherever I could. I had no plan for the future and no reason to believe I would live long enough to need one. Then, Theo found me. Theo was already a legend in our office when I met him. He had helped hundreds of people and somehow still believed that each one mattered. One night, he found me lying in the street and offered me a chance to change my life. Slowly, I stopped drinking. I found a place to live. I learned how to function again. In those days, becoming a social worker did not always require a master's degree. A bachelor's degree was enough for many positions, and before the internet, documents were easier to fake. Within a year, I was working beside Theo. The next 15 years were probably the best years of my life. Theo treated me like family, although I never allowed myself to become part of his. He often invited me to his home for dinner with his wife and children. I rejected him almost every time. I cannot count how many invitations I refused. Getting close to people never felt safe. Theo shared his feelings openly. I kept mine hidden. When he died, I realized how little I had allowed myself to know him. I always regretted that. One night, long after the office had closed, I was working alone at my desk. I was writing a case report and had lost track of time. When I looked up, Charlie was standing directly in front of me. I had not heard the front door open. I had not heard footsteps. He seemed to have appeared from nowhere. I nearly fell out of my chair. Charlie looked worse than before. His face was thin. His eyes were tired and frightened. His clothes were filthy. He weakly held out the newspaper. For a moment, I saw myself as Theo must have seen me all those years ago. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was pity. Maybe I was finally trying to behave like the man who had saved me. I pointed at the chair across from my desk. "Sit down," I said, "and keep your clothes on." Charlie immediately obeyed. I opened the newspaper and found the article. It was titled, "An Occultist's Guide to Love and Loss in the 20th Century." Charlie watched me without blinking. I finally understood that he wanted me to read the entire article. I turned on the desk lamp and began. The article was written like a sermon. Lady Hemlock claimed that the modern world had become blind because people cared only about machines, science, money, and physical things. She wrote about an invisible power flowing through certain chosen people. She called this force the current. According to her, the current came from a being known as the six-eyed crow, the universal mother. Lady Hemlock believed humanity had rejected the spiritual world. Because of that rejection, people had lost their rightful place in some great celestial order. She wrote that her grandmother had taught her never to accept less than what she was owed. Her grandmother believed compromise weakened every decision that came after it. The strangest part concerned Lady Hemlock's grandfather. She described him as an amalgam, a person formed from the combined essence of many people. Lady Hemlock claimed that her grandmother had followed ancient practices that the rest of their coven had abandoned. Even Lady Hemlock's own mother rejected those rituals. According to the article, the grandmother's loyalty to the old ways eventually made her a martyr. Lady Hemlock said she had followed her grandmother's teachings. She had created several amalgams over the years, but none had been perfect enough to father her children. Because they were imperfect, she had cast them out into the human world. She forced them to live alone, separated from the spiritual purpose for which they had been created. Lady Hemlock also admitted that she lacked the courage to openly spread her beliefs. She feared that the old knowledge would disappear beneath the noise of the modern world. She promised to correct that mistake. She wrote that every human soul carried a small piece of the ley line, and that this energy could be collected and used to approach the Universal Mother. Then she announced that she would create a new amalgam from 6 parts. The new being would contain devotion, courage, desire, wisdom, faith, and the discipline to remain silent. It would replace the failed creature that came before it. She ended by promising that anyone who followed her example would also rise into a higher state of existence. When I finished reading, the office was completely silent. Charlie was writing something on a small square of paper. I reached for it, believing he was finally going to explain himself. He lifted one finger and gently pushed my hand away. Then, he stood. He took a slow breath. His eyes closed for a moment, as though he were preparing himself for something painful. When his eyes opened, he pulled a small knife from inside his blazer. Before I could move, he drove the blade into the center of his chest. I shouted and jumped backward. Charlie dragged the knife upward through his sternum. There was no blood. A thin cloud of smoke and steam rose from the cut. The wound opened cleanly, like a line being drawn through soft clay. Charlie showed no pain. He placed both hands against his chest and pulled the opening apart. Inside him was nothing. There were no ribs, no lungs, no heart, no stomach, no blood. There was only a dark, empty space filled with pale mist. Charlie stared at me with sadness and desperation. He was not trying to frighten me. He was trying to show me the truth. Before I could understand what I was seeing, he raised the knife again. This time, he turned it toward me. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. Charlie drove the blade into my chest. I screamed. The scream did not come from pain. There was no pain. It came from pure terror. Charlie pulled the blade upward, creating a long opening in my chest. Again, no blood appeared. Steam rose from the wound. He placed his hands inside the opening and pulled. My chest separated. I looked down. I was empty. No bones, no lungs, no heart. Nothing that should have been keeping me alive. Only darkness and mist. My screaming slowly stopped. I could no longer think clearly. I sat frozen while Charlie reached into his pocket. He handed me the small square of paper. 2 words were written on it. We are kin. The truth destroyed everything I thought I understood about my life. Once a single lie falls apart, all the other lies around it begin to collapse. Charlie and I remained in the office until morning. After I recovered enough to think, he communicated by writing notes. He explained that his first memory was of a bright, blurred light. Something inside that light had given him the old newspaper and the sticky note addressed to me. A moment later, he found himself standing outside my office. He had no memories of childhood, parents, school, work, friends, or any life before that moment. He read the article several times, but did not understand what he was supposed to do. Eventually, he entered the building. When our eyes met, something happened inside him. He described it as being struck by lightning. He suddenly knew that I was what he had been searching for. One creation had recognized another. The handwriting on the sticky note did not match Charlie's handwriting. We began to believe that Lady Hemlock had written it. Thanks, Corvus. I appreciate the help. It sounded as though she had sent Charlie to me for a reason. Charlie believed we were both amalgams. The timeline supported his theory. Theo found me in 1991. I began working in the office in 1992. The Lady Hemlock murders started in 1993. If Charlie had been created during the murders, then I must have been made earlier. I had already been abandoned by the time Lady Hemlock began collecting parts for her next creation. That made me the failed predecessor mentioned in the article. Charlie was the new amalgam built from 6 traits. Perhaps each murder had provided something necessary for his creation. Devotion, courage, desire, wisdom, faith, silence. Maybe the victims had not been random at all. Perhaps Lady Hemlock had chosen each person because of something hidden inside them. The marks carved into their skulls may have been part of the process. The final pile of organs also began to make a terrible kind of sense. Lady Hemlock had been building a body. Charlie's body. But whatever she created had no organs inside it. Neither did mine. The discovery forced me to reconsider every memory I had. For years, I believed I had suffered a difficult childhood. I believed there were painful experiences buried inside my mind. But what if I never had a childhood? What if the memories were false, incomplete pieces placed inside me to help me appear human? I had always remembered nearly drowning when I was young. In the memory, I fell to the bottom of a swimming pool. There was nobody nearby to help me. Dark water entered my lungs, and just before everything disappeared, someone pulled me to the surface. I remembered sunlight burning my eyes. I remembered a woman leaning over me. I assumed she was a lifeguard. But if I had no lungs, I could not have drowned. Maybe the memory never happened. Maybe it was only an image placed inside my mind. I had always refused to go near pools, lakes, rivers, or oceans. The fear felt real, even if the event that created it was not. My years of drinking also became difficult to understand. Had I really been an alcoholic? Where did the alcohol go after I swallowed it? Did it fall into the empty darkness inside my body? Had I truly become drunk? Or had I only acted drunk because some false memory told me that was what I was supposed to do? Perhaps Theo did not find a broken alcoholic. Perhaps he found a confused creature wandering the streets without knowing what it was. That could explain why I had been able to rebuild my life so quickly. It could also explain why I never went to doctors. I had always told myself that I distrusted professionals because I knew how imperfect helping systems could be. The deeper truth may have been simpler. Some part of me knew that a doctor would discover what I was. I had never visited a therapist either. I claimed that work was enough therapy for me. Maybe I was afraid that talking about my past would reveal that there was no real past to discuss. Even my refusal to eat with Theo's family made sense. I often ate alone, usually while distracted by work. I never paid attention to what happened after I swallowed food. What would have happened if I had eaten dinner at Theo's table? Would the food have dropped into the emptiness inside me? Would his family have noticed a strange sound? Would my body have reacted in some impossible way? Perhaps I avoided people because being close to them increased the risk of being discovered. The sadness of it sometimes becomes too much. I have cried more than once since learning the truth. I spent my whole life believing I was a damaged human being. Now I know I may not be human at all. Charlie reminds me to take things one day at a time. He does not say those words aloud. He still cannot speak. He writes them down and hands them to me. He does not remember having another name, so he continues calling himself Charlie. He seems comfortable with it now. We have discussed going to the police. The problem is that we do not know what the police would do after discovering that we have no organs. They might lock us away. They might hand us over to government researchers. They might try to kill us. Then again, we are not certain we can be killed. By the time Charlie and I left the office the next morning, both wounds had completely healed. There were no scars, no bloodstains, no sign that either of us had been cut open. We are also worried that Charlie's appearance may signal the beginning of another Lady Hemlock killing cycle. The article described him as the current amalgam, but it also called him imperfect. Lady Hemlock may already be searching for 6 new victims. She may be preparing to build another creature, a better one. If that happens, Charlie and I will have to decide what to do. For now, however, it has been surprisingly good to have him around. For the first time in my life, I am not completely alone. Whatever we are the same kind of thing. We can face the truth together. That matters more than I expected. Charlie has even become interested in social work. I think he understands why I stayed in the profession. The work gives structure to lives that might otherwise feel empty. In our case, the emptiness is more than a feeling. Still, helping other people gives us something human to hold on to. Charlie will need to earn a master's degree if he wants to become a licensed social worker. Things are different now. It is no longer the 1990s, when a person could create a fake degree and hope nobody checked the records. He complains about that through written notes. I remind him that life is unfair. Not everyone gets the advantage of being created through a forbidden death ritual by an occult serial killer. Some people actually have to attend university. Story 3. Beautiful. That was the first word that entered Ian's mind when she opened the door. He had seen many people during his years as a delivery driver. Every day he walked up countless driveways, climbed endless porch steps, rang doorbells, and waited for strangers to appear. Most faces disappeared from his memory as soon as the door closed. Some people were friendly. Some were rude. Others barely looked at him while signing for their packages. But this woman was different. Ian stood on her porch beneath the warm summer sun, holding a small cardboard package in one hand and his clipboard in the other. The day around him was bright and full of life. Birds sang from the nearby trees. A lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. Children laughed in a backyard, and a dog barked behind a wooden fence. Yet the moment the woman looked at him, all those sounds seemed to fade. She had beautiful eyes. They were blue, but calling them blue did not feel like enough. They carried the deep color of an open ocean beneath a cloudless sky. They seemed bright near the edges and darker around the center, as if deep water waited behind them. For the few seconds their eyes met, Ian felt the entire world disappear. The sunlight lost its warmth. The flowers beside the porch became nothing more than blurred colors. Even the woman's face seemed to fade around those bright blue eyes. Ian felt like a sailor who had spent years wandering across empty seas and had finally found the place where he belonged. He knew he was staring. He also knew that he should stop. Still, he could not pull his gaze away. "Do I need to sign?" the woman asked. Her voice brought him back. Ian blinked and quickly raised the clipboard. He put on the polite smile he used with every customer. "Yes, please, just at the bottom." She took the pen and looked down at the form. Ian watched her eyelashes lower over those beautiful eyes, hiding them from him. For one strange moment, he felt almost offended. It seemed unfair that something so lovely could simply disappear behind a blink. She signed her name, handed back the clipboard, and smiled. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Ian replied. He turned away before she noticed that his hand was trembling. He walked down the porch steps and returned to his delivery van. When he climbed inside, he sat behind the wheel without moving. His fingers remained wrapped around the clipboard, but his mind was still standing on the porch. He could see those eyes. Even after the woman closed the door, Ian imagined them staring through the wood. Their color stayed clear in his memory. It seemed brighter than the summer sky above him, and deeper than any ocean he had ever seen. A car horn sounded behind the van. Ian jumped, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. He continued his route as if nothing had happened. He delivered packages to apartment buildings, small houses, office blocks, and local stores. He smiled at customers, asked for signatures, and wished people a good afternoon. But he remembered almost none of them. Every few minutes, his mind returned to the woman with the blue eyes. He imagined what it must be like for her to see them every morning in the mirror. Did she understand how rare they were? Did she stop and admire them? Or did she treat them like ordinary things, never realizing the beauty she carried? The thought bothered him more than it should have. By the time his shift ended, the sky had turned orange. Ian parked the delivery van at the company lot, signed out, and drove home in his own car. He lived alone in a small house at the end of a quiet street. The outside looked normal. The lawn was cut. The curtains were clean. There were no broken windows, piles of trash, or signs that anything unusual happened inside. Ian preferred it that way. He entered the house, locked the door behind him, and checked it twice. Then he walked through the silent rooms, closing every curtain before going upstairs. His bedroom was small and plain. A narrow bed stood against one wall. A wooden dresser sat across from it. There were no family photographs, paintings, or decorations. The walls were pale and empty except for one shelf above the bed. Only one object rested on that shelf: a glass jar. Ian removed his uniform and changed into a clean shirt and loose pants. He ate a simple dinner without turning on the television. He did not like background noise. It made it harder to hear them. After washing his plate, he returned to his bedroom and lay down. For nearly an hour, he stared at the wall. Then his eyes slowly moved toward the shelf. The jar caught the light from his bedside lamp. Inside it, several round shapes floated in clear, preserving liquid. They rested against one another like expensive gems displayed behind glass. Ian's most valuable possessions. His treasures, Some were brown with golden centers like polished amber. Others carried lighter shades, soft and warm like topaz beneath sunlight. One pair appeared almost gray, but when the light touched them, they shone like pale moonstones. Ian had collected them carefully over the years. Each one had required patience. He never acted without planning. That was how careless people were caught. Ian studied routines, learned when houses were empty, watched which doors were left unlocked, and discovered where cameras were placed. Sometimes he waited weeks before deciding that the moment was right. He told himself that he was not cruel. Cruel people destroyed beautiful things. Ian preserved them. He kept the jar sealed and clean. He changed the liquid regularly and made sure the shelf remained free of dust. Every morning before work, he held the jar in both hands and admired the colors. They looked back at him. They had once frightened him when they first began to speak. Now their voices were as familiar as his own thoughts. That night, however, Ian frowned as he studied his collection. The eyes inside the jar were beautiful. He had always believed that. Their different shades created a perfect display, each pair offering something special. Yet something was missing. His collection contained warm browns, golden yellows, and soft gray. But there was no deep blue among them. No color like the ocean. No color like the clear summer sky. Ian turned away from the shelf. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But the woman's face appeared in the darkness. More than her face, he saw her eyes. Those bright blue circles seemed to float in his mind, glowing against the blackness. His treasures noticed. He felt their stares pressing against his back. At first, the room remained silent. Then came a soft sound from the shelf. It was not the movement of glass or liquid. It was closer to a whisper, so quiet that Ian could have convinced himself it was only the wind outside. You claim our beauty is magnificent, yet Ian's body became stiff. You look away. He bit the side of his knuckle and pulled his knees toward his chest. The voices did not come through his ears in the usual way. They seemed to rise inside his skull, passing through his thoughts like cold fingers. "Stop," Ian whispered. "Speak up." I said stop. "Why do you turn away from us?" Ian pressed his face into the pillow. "I'm tired." You were not too tired to admire the blue. His eyes opened. For a moment, he did not breathe. The jar knew. Of course it knew. His treasures always knew when his attention belonged to something else. They had become jealous before, especially after he brought home a new edition. The older ones feared that he might stop admiring them. "I didn't mean anything," Ian said. "You thought she was more beautiful than us." "No, you wished to look at her instead." "That isn't true." The jar remained still upon the shelf, but Ian imagined every eye inside turning toward him. "You saw what we lack." He bit his knuckle harder. "I can't." "And why not?" "Because I just can't." "That is not an answer." Ian sat up, keeping his back turned to the shelf. I promised myself there would be no more. The room became quiet. For several seconds, Ian believed the voices had stopped. Then they laughed. The sound was gentle, almost loving, which made it worse. "No more? I mean it. Do you no longer wish to save that which is beautiful?" "I have enough." "Enough?" The words seemed to come from every corner of the bedroom. Ian squeezed his eyes shut. True beauty must be preserved so that it may always be admired. To leave such beauty unprotected would be a terrible mistake. I said no. "A mistake," the voices continued. perhaps even a crime. Ian shook his head. He remembered every promise he had made after the last one. He remembered washing his tools in the bathroom sink, watching thin lines of red disappear down the drain. He remembered sitting on the floor afterward, shaking so badly that he could barely hold a glass of water. He had told himself that his collection was complete. He had sworn that he would never do it again. His treasures had remained quiet for months, until today. Would you truly allow everything you have gathered to remain unfinished? It isn't unfinished. There is no sea among us. Ian pulled the blanket over his head. There is no sky. Please, do we not deserve better? He placed both hands over his ears, although he knew it would not help. Every day we welcome your gaze. Every day we bless your sight with our beauty. Leave me alone. And yet, you deny us fulfillment. The words came so close that Ian felt warm breath against his ear. The hairs rose on the back of his neck. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone beside the bed. No one was there, only the jar. The eyes floated silently in the clear liquid. They looked patient. They looked hungry. Bring us the color of the sea. Ian's breathing slowed. Bring us the hue of the sky. The woman's face returned to his mind. He saw her standing in the bright doorway, smiling politely, unaware that the most beautiful part of her had already been chosen. Ian lowered his hands. The voices became soft and comforting. Bring us sapphire. Ian opened his eyes. The fear inside him disappeared. In its place came purpose. He climbed out of bed and dressed quickly. His movements felt calm now, almost automatic. He put on dark clothing and chose shoes that would make little noise. Then he collected his car keys from the dresser. Before leaving the bedroom, he looked at the jar. The treasures stared back at him. Soon, he said, the house seemed to sigh with relief. Ian walked downstairs and opened the closet near the kitchen. Behind several old coats sat a black tool bag. He placed it on the table and checked everything inside. Lockpicks, duct tape, gloves, plastic sheets, small bottles of cleaning solution, scalpels stored in protective cases. His reliable tools. Ian handled them with the same care an experienced jeweler might show to delicate instruments. Every object had a purpose. Every tool helped with the safe handling and extraction of precious gems. He checked the sharpness of one blade beneath the kitchen light. Then he smiled. Outside, the neighborhood was sleeping. Ian placed the bag in the trunk, climbed into his car, and started the engine. He remembered the woman's address easily. He remembered every address. The drive took less than 30 minutes. Ian parked 2 streets away and completed the rest of the journey on foot. The summer air had cooled, and a light breeze moved through the trees. Most houses were dark. Somewhere in the distance, a television played behind an open window. He approached the woman's house from the back. The yard was surrounded by a wooden fence, but one section was low enough to climb. Ian crossed the grass and stopped beside the rear door. He listened carefully. Silence. He removed the lockpicks from his bag. The door opened in less than a minute. Ian stepped inside and slowly closed it behind him. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and laundry soap. A clock ticked in the living room. Family photographs stood on shelves and tables. Ian avoided looking at them. Faces created unnecessary feelings, and feelings made the work difficult. He climbed the stairs. At the end of the hallway, light shone beneath the bedroom door. Ian waited. He heard the woman moving inside. A drawer opened. Water ran in a nearby bathroom. Then the bedroom light went dark. Ian stood in the hallway for a long time. He did not rush. True beauty deserved patience. When he finally entered the room, the woman was asleep. Moonlight passed through the curtains, falling across her face. Her eyes were closed, hidden beneath their delicate lids. Ian felt disappointment. He wanted to see the blue once more before taking it. He moved closer. The floor creaked. The woman woke. Her eyes opened wide. For one perfect second, the moonlight touched them. Sapphire, Ian returned home before sunrise. He took a long shower, cleaned his tools, and burned the clothes he had worn. Then he went upstairs carrying a smaller glass container. His hands still trembled, but not from fear. He stood before the shelf and carefully opened the jar. The voices welcomed him. He added the new treasures to the collection. The blue eyes floated among the amber, topaz, and moonstone shades. Their color seemed even richer beneath the bedroom light. They were more beautiful than Ian remembered. At last, the collection felt balanced. At last, the ocean and sky were among them. Ian held the jar close to his face. "You're safe now," he whispered. "No one will ever fail to appreciate you again." The blue eyes stared back at him. For several months, Ian was content. Every morning, he admired his collection before leaving for work. Every evening, he cleaned the shelf and checked the preserving liquid. The treasures remained quiet because they were happy. Ian believed his promise had only been broken once. He would never need another. Summer faded slowly. The days became shorter. The warm air cooled, and the green leaves began to change. Reds, oranges, and yellows appeared across the trees. Ian admired the new colors during his delivery route. Beauty was everywhere in autumn. It covered the streets, filled the parks, and gathered in piles beneath people's feet. Ian often wondered how anyone could walk through fallen leaves without noticing their rich colors. One crisp afternoon, he drove through a quiet neighborhood carrying a small package. The wind pushed dry leaves across the road. They scraped over the pavement like tiny bones. Ian parked beside the curb and checked the address. The house was old, but well cared for. Small pumpkins decorated the porch steps, and a wreath of orange leaves hung on the front door. Ian picked up the package and clipboard, then walked toward the house. As he climbed the steps, he breathed in the cool autumn air. The season had a clean smell, mixed with dry wood, cold earth, and distant chimney smoke. He rang the doorbell. While waiting, he turned toward the trees lining the street. Their colors were remarkable. Bright red leaves hung beside deep orange ones. Yellow branches glowed beneath the pale sunlight. Ian smiled as he studied them. As much as I love the change, he quietly said to himself, "I have to admit, I miss seeing all the front door opened." Ian turned around and raised the package. The rest of the sentence died in his throat. A woman stood in the doorway. Her hair was dark, and she wore a thick gray sweater. She offered Ian a polite smile, but he barely noticed anything except her eyes. Green, not ordinary green. They carried the deep, rich shade of a forest after rain. Near the center, small golden marks caught the light like sunlight shining through leaves. The color was alive and bright, reminding Ian of spring gardens, wild fields, and hidden places beneath tall trees. He stared. The woman's smile became uncertain. "Hello," Ian blinked. His training returned, and he quickly put on his best customer service expression. "Good afternoon. I have a package that needs a signature." He held out the clipboard. The woman looked away from him and began signing. Ian watched her closely. For those few seconds, he wanted nothing more than for her to raise her gaze again. He wanted to see that beautiful green light. He wanted to study every small change in color around her pupils. Instead, he forced himself to remain still. He thought about the jar waiting on the shelf at home. Every morning, he woke early and admired the elegance of his collection. He held the glass carefully in both hands, turning it beneath the light so that every color could shine. Amber, topaz, moonstone, sapphire, his precious gemstones. His treasurers looked back at him while he praised their beauty. They enjoyed his attention. They wanted his love, his admiration, and his complete devotion. They had been quiet for months. But as Ian stared at the woman's lowered face, he imagined their voices waking once again. The woman finished signing and handed back the clipboard. "Here you go." "Thank you," Ian said. She took the package from him. Ian stepped away from the door, but before turning, he looked into her eyes one last time. The green seemed brighter now, a blooming forest in spring, a perfect emerald hidden inside an ordinary face. Ian smiled politely and walked down the porch steps. Behind him, the woman closed the door. He returned to his van and placed the clipboard on the passenger seat. For several seconds, he sat without starting the engine. He already knew what would happen that night. The jar would whisper. The eyes would remind him that the collection was not complete. They would tell him that true beauty had to be protected. They would explain that leaving such a rare color in the world was a waste. Ian looked back at the house through the side mirror. A curtain moved in one of the windows. Perhaps the woman was watching him leave. Ian started the van. He pulled away from the curb and continued his route, but his thoughts remained behind. At home, his collection waited patiently. Amber, topaz, moonstone, and sapphire. All beautiful, all carefully preserved. But still missing one final treasure. Ian smiled as the autumn leaves moved across the road ahead of him. Soon, he would have emerald. Story 4. My parents never explained why we had to play the game of silence. It happened every night at exactly 10 o'clock. It did not matter if it was a school night, a weekend, a birthday, or a holiday. At 10, everything stopped. The television was turned off. Phones were placed face down. The kitchen lights were dimmed, and all four of us gathered in the living room. Dad always sat in the old armchair beside the fireplace. Mom sat on the sofa, usually with her hands folded tightly in her lap. My little sister Emma sat beside her, holding the stuffed rabbit she had owned since she was a baby. I sat in the chair closest to the hallway. Then Dad placed the kitchen timer on the table. He turned the dial slowly, and the loud clicking filled the room. Tick, tick, tick. The moment he released it, the game began. The rules were simple, but they were never treated like ordinary rules. We were not allowed to speak. We were not allowed to stand. We were not allowed to move around the house. We could not cough, sneeze, laugh, cry, or whisper. We were supposed to sit completely still until the timer rang. I never knew how long Dad set it for. Sometimes it felt like 20 minutes. Other nights it felt like hours. I was never brave enough to look at the numbers on the timer. When I was younger, I thought it was only a strange family tradition. I thought my parents were teaching us discipline or trying to help us become more patient. But as I grew older, I began to understand that it was not really a game. Games were supposed to be fun. The game of silence was something we survived. I learned that lesson when I was 7 years old. That night began like every other. The timer was ticking, the lights were low, and my parents were sitting as still as statues. I remember feeling a dry itch deep in my throat. I tried to swallow it away, but it only grew worse. My eyes watered. My chest tightened. I pressed my lips together and held my breath. The cough escaped anyway. It was small, barely louder than a breath. The moment the sound left my mouth, the temperature dropped. I felt something pass behind me. Then a cold, sharp touch dragged across my shoulder. It felt like the edge of a knife made from ice. My skin opened beneath my shirt, leaving a thin cut from the base of my neck to the top of my arm. I wanted to scream. Every part of my body begged me to cry out, but when I looked at my parents, I stopped myself. Their faces were filled with pure terror. Mom had both hands pressed over her mouth. Dad stared at the space behind me, his eyes wide and his face completely drained of color. Neither of them moved to help me. Neither of them spoke. That was when I understood. The cough had attracted something. Whatever it was, it had touched me. And if I screamed, it would touch me again. I sat there for the rest of the game with blood slowly soaking through my shirt. Tears ran down my face, but I made no sound. I barely breathed. When the timer finally rang, the pressure in the room disappeared. The air became warm again, and Mom rushed toward me. Dad locked every door and checked every window before taking me into the kitchen. He cleaned the cut himself. His hands shook the entire time. Later, he sat beside me on my bed. "You can never break the rules again," he said. His voice was so low that I almost did not hear him. I asked him what had cut me. He looked toward the bedroom door before answering. "They don't like noise. Who are they?" Dad was silent for a long moment. Then he stood up and turned off my light. "Just remember the rules." After that, I became very good at staying quiet. I learned how to hold back a sneeze until my head hurt. I learned how to breathe without making a sound. I learned how to ignore the strange movements in the corners of the room and the whispers that sometimes came from the hallway. The game of silence became part of our lives. We never invited anyone to stay late. We never went out after 9. If a school event, family visit, or emergency threatened to keep us away from home at 10, my parents became nervous and angry. Once, when our car broke down, Dad made us sit in complete silence on the side of the road while he set the timer on his phone. Even there, far from the house, the air became cold. That was when I realized the game was not connected to the living room. It was connected to us. Years passed, but my parents still refused to explain where it had come from. Whenever I asked, Mom changed the subject. Dad became quiet. Eventually, I stopped asking. Then came the night Emma disappeared. The house felt wrong from the moment I woke up that morning. Mom spent most of the day pacing through the kitchen. She washed the same cup 3 times. She kept checking the clock, even though it was still hours before 10. Every few minutes, she looked toward the hallway as if she expected someone to appear there. Dad barely spoke. He stayed in the garage until dinner, then sat at the table without eating. His jaw was tight, and he kept rubbing the scar across the back of his hand. I had seen that scar all my life, but I had never asked where it came from. Emma was nervous too. She was only 8, but she understood enough to know when something was wrong. She followed Mom from room to room, holding her stuffed rabbit against her chest. At one point, Emma whispered to me that she had seen someone standing at the top of the stairs. I asked her who it was. She said she did not know. They didn't have a face, she told me. I wanted to tell Dad, but when I looked at him, I knew he already knew. At 9:55, he ordered us into the living room. No one argued. Mom sat on the sofa with Emma beside her. Dad lowered himself into his chair. I took my usual place near the hallway, though I wished I could sit farther away from it. The house was quiet before the game even began. Not ordinary quiet. It felt as if the walls were listening. At exactly 10, Dad set the timer on the table. The ticking started. We became still. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. I stared at the floor and counted my breaths. Emma held her rabbit so tightly that its old cloth ears bent beneath her fingers. Then, a soft thump came from upstairs. Dad's hand tightened around the armrest. Something had fallen. No one moved. A second sound followed, a slow creak. Then, footsteps began crossing the upstairs floor. They were heavy and careful, as though whoever was walking wanted us to hear every step. The sound moved from one side of the house to the other. Then it stopped at the top of the stairs. Mom's breath caught in her throat. It was only a tiny sound, but Dad looked sharply toward her. We waited. One step creaked, then another. Something was coming down. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, but I could imagine it moving through the darkness. The staircase was just beyond the living room doorway. Each step sounded louder than the last. When the footsteps reached the bottom, the living room door slowly opened. There was no one standing there. The hallway beyond it was empty and dark. Cold air entered the room. Within seconds, I could see my breath. Emma began trembling beside Mom. Her rabbit shook in her hands. I wanted to reach for her, but movement was also forbidden. The darkness in the hallway looked thicker than it should have. It did not seem like an empty space without light. It looked like something solid, something gathered together and waiting. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were so faint that I thought I imagined them. They came from somewhere inside the walls, like voices speaking from another room. I could not understand the words. I did not want to. Dad slowly shook his head, warning us not to listen. The whispers grew louder. Some sounded like adults. Others sounded like children. One of them sounded exactly like my grandmother, even though she had died years earlier. Then I heard my own voice. It whispered from the hallway, "Come closer." My stomach twisted. The timer kept ticking on the table. Each click seemed painfully loud. Something began scraping across the upstairs floor. The sound moved slowly toward the staircase, dragging something heavy behind it. Scrape, pause, it reached the stairs. Then came 3 soft knocks against the wall. Tap, tap, tap. A few seconds later, the knocks came again. Louder, closer, tap, tap, tap. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Dad stared straight ahead, but his face looked broken. Emma suddenly stood up. My heart almost stopped. Her stuffed rabbit dropped to the floor. She took one slow step toward the open doorway. Her eyes were half closed. She was sleepwalking. Emma had walked in her sleep before, but never during the game. Usually, Mom gently guided her back to bed. This time, Mom started to rise, but Dad lifted one hand and stopped her. His message was clear. Do not move. Mom stared at him in disbelief. Emma took another step toward the hallway. The darkness seemed to shift. Long shadows stretched across the floor toward her feet. I wanted to call her name. I wanted to grab her and pull her back. Instead, I dug my nails into my palms and remained silent. Emma reached the doorway. The scraping sound stopped. The whispers changed. Now every voice was saying the same word. Emma, Emma, Emma. Her small body leaned toward the darkness. Mom could not bear it anymore. She jumped up. Dad grabbed her wrist before she could reach Emma. "No," he whispered. It was the first word spoken during the game. The entire house went silent. Even the timer seemed to stop for one terrible second. Mom stared at him. Dad's face was filled with pain. "Let her go," he said. I could not believe what I was hearing. Emma stepped into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind her. The force shook the walls. The lights flickered, and a deep groan moved through the house. Then the cold disappeared. A second later, the timer rang. The game was over. For several moments, none of us moved. I stared at the closed door. Emma was gone. I expected my parents to rush after her. Instead, they stayed where they were. Mom covered her face and began crying. Dad leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing. "Where is she?" I whispered. No one answered. I stood. "Where is Emma?" Mom slowly lowered her hands. "We can't go after her." I thought I had heard her wrong. "What do you mean?" "The game is over," she said. "She's 8 years old." I shouted. "She's somewhere in the house." Dad looked toward the door. "It's too late." Anger burned through my fear. "You let her go." Neither of them denied it. I ran to the door and pulled it open. The hallway on the other side was not the hallway I knew. It was longer. The walls stretched into darkness. Family photographs hung at strange angles, and some of them showed people I had never seen before. The ceiling seemed too high, and the floor tilted slightly beneath my feet. Behind me, Mom called my name, but I ignored her. "Emma," I shouted. My voice echoed through the altered house. There was no answer. Then I heard crying upstairs. I ran toward the staircase. Each step groaned beneath me. The cold returned as I climbed, growing stronger with every step. At the top, the hallway seemed to continue much farther than the outside of the house should have allowed. Doors lined both walls. Some were familiar. Others had never been there before. Emma's crying came from the direction of her bedroom. I followed it. When I reached her door, it stood slightly open. A thin line of pale light shone through the gap. I pushed it open. Emma stood in the center of the room with her back to me. Her stuffed rabbit lay near her feet. I did not remember seeing her take it with her. Relief rushed through me. "Emma?" She did not turn. She was whispering something. I stepped closer. "Emma, it's me." The room felt wrong. Shadows moved across the walls even though nothing blocked the light. They rose and fell like slow breaths. Emma stopped whispering. Then she turned around. Her face looked pale, almost white. Her eyes were open, but they did not seem to see me. A thin red line crossed the front of her neck. It looked like the cut I had received years earlier. "Emma?" She smiled. It was not her smile. "You should have stayed quiet," she said. The bedroom doors slammed behind me. I turned and grabbed the handle, but it would not move. The whispers returned. This time, they came from every corner of the room. The shadows began pulling away from the walls. They took shapes that almost looked human. Long arms formed from the darkness, heads bent beneath the ceiling. Their bodies remained thin and unfinished, like figures drawn in smoke. "They're here," Emma whispered. I pushed harder against the door. "What do they want?" Her smile widened. "They want to play." The shadows moved closer. Cold fingers brushed the back of my neck. I felt a sharp line of pain beginning beneath my ear. I forced myself not to scream. A crash sounded downstairs. Then Mom shouted Emma's name. The shadows turned toward the door. I threw my shoulder against it. The wood cracked. I hit it again, and the door flew open. I grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her into the hallway. At first, she resisted. Her fingers reached toward the darkness behind us, but I did not let go. We ran toward the stairs. The strange hallway seemed to stretch as we moved. The staircase became farther away, though we were running directly toward it. The whispers followed us. Stay. Play. Be quiet. Finally, we reached the stairs and rushed down. Mom and Dad stood at the bottom. Behind them, the living room was filled with darkness. It poured from the corners and spread across the floor like black fog. We have to leave, I shouted. Mom looked toward the front door. Dad shook his head. If we leave, they'll follow. They're already following us. The shadows began flowing down the staircase behind Emma and me. Dad looked at Mom. Something passed between them without words. Then he turned to me. This is our fault. What is? The game. Mom began crying again. We started it before you were born, she said. The shadows crawled closer. Dad spoke quickly. When your mother and I first moved into this house, we found an old box in the attic. There was a timer inside it and a piece of paper with instructions. We thought it was some kind of children's game. You played it? Mom nodded. We invited friends over. We turned off the lights. We promised not to speak until the timer rang. Her voice shook. One of our friends broke the silence. Something took him. Dad looked toward the dark hallway. We tried to stop playing after that, but every night at 10, the timer started by itself. Things came into the house. They hurt us. They followed us when we tried to leave. So you kept playing. We thought following the rules would protect us, Mom said. For years it did. I looked at Emma. Her eyes were becoming clearer, but she was still pale and weak. Why did you let her go? Dad closed his eyes. Because they demanded someone tonight. My stomach turned. You sacrificed her? No, Mom said quickly. We thought if we stayed still, they would only take her for the length of the game. That happened once before. With who? Dad looked down at the scar on his hand. My brother. I stared at him. He came back when the timer rang, Dad said. Emma was supposed to come back too. But she didn't. No. The shadows reached the bottom of the stairs. Dad stepped in front of them. Take Emma and go. You said they'll follow. They will, he answered. But they can only follow the person who broke the final rule. I understood. Dad had whispered during the game. Mom had screamed afterward. They were keeping the shadows tied to themselves. You knew this would happen, I said. Dad nodded. We knew one day the game would ask for more than silence. Mom moved toward Emma and kissed her forehead. Go, she whispered. Emma began crying. I wanted to argue. I wanted to stay and help them. But the shadows were rising behind my parents, forming tall bodies in the living room. Dad grabbed the kitchen timer from the table. Its hands had started moving again. The timer had reset itself. Tick, tick, tick. He turned to face the darkness. Run, I took Emma's hand. We raced toward the front door. The lights exploded behind us. Mom screamed. I heard Dad shout something, but the sound was swallowed by the whispers. I pulled the door open, and Emma and I fell into the cold night air. The door slammed shut. We ran across the yard and into the street. Neither of us looked back until we reached the end of the block. When I finally turned, The house was completely dark. No lights shone from the windows. No shadows moved behind the curtains. It looked empty. But I knew my parents were still inside. Emma stood beside me, trembling. "We made it," I told her. The words sounded weak. She looked at me. "Did we?" I had no answer. We spent that night at a neighbor's house. The police came the next morning, but when they entered our home, they found no sign of our parents. There was no blood. There were no broken doors. The house looked normal again. The kitchen timer was missing. Emma and I were sent to live with our aunt in another town. I tried to tell her the truth, but she believed the trauma of losing our parents had confused us. For a few months, nothing happened. We began to believe the game had ended in that house. Then one night, at exactly 10 o'clock, I heard ticking. It came from inside the wall of our new bedroom. Emma heard it too. We sat up in bed and looked at each other. Tick, 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 the room began to grow cold. A whisper moved through the darkness. "Let's play." Since then, we have followed the rules every night. No talking, no moving, no noise. We sit in silence until the ticking stops. Sometimes I feel cold fingers touch the scar on my shoulder. Sometimes Emma whispers in her sleep, and I have to cover her mouth before the sound becomes too loud. I do not know what happened to my parents. Part of me believes they are still alive somewhere inside that changed version of the house, sitting in the dark and waiting for the timer to ring. But another part of me knows the truth. The game of silence does not let people go. It only changes players. Emma and I escaped the house, but we never escaped the game. And every night at exactly 10, the unseen timer begins counting down again.